There are some schools which still need infrastructure in terms of the classrooms. Things like water, things like latrines. Mostly those schools are in the rural areas, and perhaps this is where the county government should look into, not just look at schools which have got good infrastructure already, but also go into those other smaller schools which do not have those facilities. And it seems to me that there are those schools which do not seem to have benefited from the devolution of education.
And the same, Brian, the same question in terms of the infrastructural developments we have had in school, but also talk to us about, given that the learning system we have been able to change, I'm sure you did not study under the current CBC that has been brought. Talk to us about that change as a person and what you have been able to experience as well.
Well, yes, you're right. I went through the 844 system up until the age of 18, and then I went to the UK. But in terms of, obviously, the learning system, the CBC, I think, is being trialed. So we're yet to see, how effective or how good it is, or how efficient it will be for the students. But when you're talking about these 14 years, I also want to look at the softer elements of it, because you can see even in terms of democracy, it's being enhanced. So there's a lot more accountability. There's a lot more institutions that have been created, ESCC, the Office of the DPP, and so on. So all these institutions and bodies are also been brought in to bring better governance to our country. So that's what I would say on that matter.
Dr. given that you're well-traveled, you've even written a book called The Black Ostrich Home Away from Home. Talk to us about where this particular issue of changing the learning system, it was back then different from what you, if you're in the country, studied. True. It went to 844, now we are going to the CBC. Was this change warranted?
That is to be determined at some point, because I remember in the old days when we used to have the system that I went through,
yes,
which also had students going to the university being filtered through the Form 6 classes. And that was changed to other systems, and it's been changed a couple of times. One of the things I would say is that we are yet to see which of those systems works the best. If you ask me from where I'm seated, I would say that the outside world, the first world, so to speak, has systems which are predictable. So the idea of predictability in education, to me, is key. In other words, experts, and I'm not one of them, need to sit down and come up with systems that can be predicted. The parents can know what to expect in the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. The students also have a chance to see where they would be in 10 years. And so predictability is a key. And number two, there needs to be a consistency, in which case we do not change systems just because they're not working right now. To me, there are things that can be tweaked in the education system. We had technical schools in the old days, which I went through, which prepared students to either do self-employment or go into the sector in engineering capacity. That probably has changed to some level. And because the economy seems to be growing in a way that is not quite supporting, in my view, the number of students coming out of these technical schools and universities. So what is it that we can do in order to align the two, the industry as well as the education system, where the majority of the students, maybe not all of them, but a good number of them, can be channeled to those areas?
And on the same question, given that, Brian, you're not a stranger to different systems, given that you've traveled across the world, we're talking about changing of this particular system, and the same question, was it warranted, and could this also solve some of the gaps maybe the government saw within the education sector?
Well, I'll speak again, maybe based off my experience, like you've said. At least from from what I've seen in terms of education, how it's structured, let's say in the United Kingdom. So firstly, there is scholarships that are issued to students so that it enables them, first of all, everybody to get a fair chance at education. Why is that important? Because it's only through that, it's only through proper, equitable, sort of allowing students to be able to access education that they can then grow and contribute to the development of the country. So what I've seen is, of course, in terms of funding, like student loans for students is made available for all students, right? That's a very important point. They also get something that you call maintenance or allowances. So this covers their accommodation, it covers their living expenses, it covers their food. And these loans are only repayable once you get a job that gives you a certain income threshold. And they even have something called loan forgiveness. So after a number of years, you know, that loan can be written off. I think it's about 30 years. So, you know, in terms of Kenya, in terms of changing the academic model from 844 to CBC, we also need to look at the funding element so that we can bring in more people who don't have access to this education, which is very vital, as engineer has just said here, and allows a lot of people to actually access that. Because I think that's the biggest problem when you look at the new model that's being proposed, is how do you get more people to be able to access education? Yeah, that's the challenge you've seen.
And on the same issue, Daktari, you've seen what the government is proposing under the new university funding model. The government even increasing the bands to 5 now, so as to ensure that some of these children are not left behind. So what are your initial views and what could be done better?
My first attempt to look at this is that there needs to be transparency. Transparency in the sense that even those kids who are in those very rural areas have the same access, just the same as like Brian just said, that they have the same access to loans and classes and schools and opportunities as the same as those who are living in the urban areas like Nairobi, Nyeri, Thika, and so on and so forth. So to me, I think first and foremost is we need to be honest with ourselves and pin down what transparency looks like so that each and every kid in Kenya has the same equal opportunity to access school and to access the funds that are necessary to be able to build that.
And indeed, education is expensive. We all agree there. But accessibility is the issue. So how accessible are education sectors so that at the end of the day, they can even match up to the needs of the job markets out there, Brian?
Yeah, and also, yeah, that's a good point, because we're not only just looking at the, let's say, formalized degrees, you know, the conventional engineering, law, medicine, and so on. There's also the TVETs. Which give a lot of the students very good hands-on skills they can also take to industry. And those should not be forgotten. In fact, majority fall in that category. So we need to see more funding going into the TVETs institutions, which will again tie up to some of the government projects like the affordable housing. You know, it was talked that that will bring skills in different areas, masonry, plumbing, electrical, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of how we need to see the growth.
And Daktari, on that issue Brian is talking about, we have even seen some of the graduates from the KCC 2023, most of them who at least scored a C+ and above, they're opting to go to TVETs despite gaining the opportunity to enter into universities. What does that say about our country? Are we moving towards the manufacturing side, towards industrialization, or?
That would be a wonderful thing to do, because the world is moving towards manufacturing. There are so many things that need to be manufactured, and we need to be able to manufacture products in our own country. There was a time in history when we used to have manufacturing plants across the country. I don't know where they went to. That's to be determined by somebody else. But TVET, I'm a student of TVET myself. It was called technical schools in the day. And what I learned from my technical education in the day, I still use it today. Even though I'm in education in other areas, I still use those skills to date. Because what we learned in technical schools is the basics of what engineering is all about. Brian can vouch to this at some point. Therefore, to me, I think we are moving slowly towards that place where we are manufacturing. Because if we are not manufacturing, if we are not producing, we're just doing the agricultural piece of it. I think we'll be left behind, because manufacturing is probably where the whole world is moving towards. We need to be able to produce. But the other point of that is the devolution should also take into account what products can be manufactured at the county level. In other words, we are not saying that we concentrate everything in Nairobi or the major centers. There needs to be, perhaps, there needs to be manufacturing industries through TVET at the local level, at the county level, not just Nairobi. Production needs to go to those places so that the students who come out of these universities and the TVETs and the other institutions can do their production, put their skills at the local level.
Because, Brian, we've seen this administration clear on that particular point. They don't want to import things into the country. They want them to be made locally so that they can boost, especially the Jokali sector in the country. But given that you have been in that particular infrastructural sector, especially in the transport system, how vital will this be, especially equipping institutions such as the TVET so that it can bring out learners and they can find jobs out there? You do know unemployment is the problem. So where is the missing gap, or which gap is supposed to be filled to ensure that from the university to the job market is well bridged?
Yeah, I think it's we need to increase the opportunities that are out there. So, like I said, instead of maybe the very formalized programs, we also need to open. We're living in a digital economy, and one of the government programs that I think also should continue to be enhanced is the digital hubs across the country. I know the president, it was earlier this year, where through the commitment from CCI, we're meant to create about 10,000 digital jobs in the country. And the beauty for remote jobs is, it's an equalizer. Nobody is really, especially if you get employed from abroad, people don't really know some of these universities. There's a presence bias when you're here and you're trying to get an opportunity, and maybe somebody is judging you because you're coming from a certain university and so on. So I think if we have more jobs, yes, engineers talked about manufacturing, but also the digital jobs, it can help bridge the gap between the students that are coming out of university, and there are many of them with no jobs, and then having access to something to do. And like I said, also the TVET's institutions, I think, is very, very important, building those skills.
And Daktari, we have seen a number of students, once some of them even complete high school, they opt to go outside the country to study abroad as opposed to staying here in the country. We have seen even majority of Kenyans, due to the credibility of our education system, going outside there. So aside from that as well, are there opportunities for this young generation such as ours out there? When we go study out there, we can be able to live and work there as well?
I would be an advocate of students going outside of the country, whether it's abroad or across borders in Africa. For the simple reason that we need to expand our horizons. There's a saying, vernaculars, all of us, that any kid who stays at home thinks that his or her mother is the best cook in the world. Now that notion alone, I think we are past that already. We need to have opportunities. I think this has already been proposed, and I think it's ongoing now with the government proposal that students are going to other countries, for example, Germany and other places. It is a good thing for them to go out there, not to disregard the education we have here, because already the education in Kenya has prepared most of the students to be able to perform well in other countries. One of the anecdotes I would say is that in the US, for example, a survey that was carried out a couple of years ago, probably 2-3 years ago, African students do very well. Nigeria was #1, Ghana was #2, Kenya was #3. And that's not a bad thing given the numbers. So we cannot discount the education that we have here in Kenya. Therefore, yes, I would advocate for students to move out and go to schools outside of Kenya. But at the same time, not to discount the education that we have here. It is good education. It just probably needs some little tweaking here and there.
And of course, do you agree with that? Or do we need to tweak our education system so that we can also be very viable in other countries? But does that even encourage brain drain?
No, I don't think it does. I think we're constantly learning and we're constantly improving. You know, we are 61-year-old democracy. So I don't think anything is finite. I think we need to keep improving our systems, and education is no exception. So we are trialing the KBC system. I think there's still improvements and learning to do. Of course, we need to do a lot of benchmarking as well across different countries to see how well competence-based curriculum assists students. But yeah, I think, you know, the reality is there's going to be shortage of opportunities here. So if you can create, you know, I've been a beneficiary of studying abroad and work there, live there and work there. And obviously it has also opened up in terms of my way of thinking, you know, and I'm very fortunate to have that opportunity, but to interact with different people from different backgrounds, different cultural, religious beliefs and so on and so forth really helps hone your mindset and allows you to think more of as a global citizen other than just focusing on what we have here.
And gentlemen, you are aware now that Kenya has been able to push its candidate to the African Union Commission chairperson in the form of the Right Honorable Raila Amolo Odinga, who will be going to be seeking that particular position that is going to jostle it out with other candidates, especially from Djibouti, given that they have been saying that it is the East African opportune time for the East African region to be able to clinch this particular seat. How vital will that be, especially, Dr. Nyaga, talk to us on the education front? We have been seeing majorly the AU chairpersons previously who have held this particular post have been advocating for better education within the continent, boosting of trade. So how vital will it be for our country and to our education system?
That's a great question, and I wish our candidate the best. And we need to have a candidate like Raila Amolo Odinga at the AUC. It is #1. I think all of us would say that even the students who are in school would say that he's a good role model. So at the AUC, having him as a role model and advocating for the education. He is also a student of foreign education, so he knows probably much better than most people. He knows the value of education, and if and when he gets into the AUC, I believe that he'll be able to advocate for good education system to work with the Western world in order to improve the education systems across Africa, not just Kenya, but across Africa.
And the same question to you, Brian, as well. Looking at the infrastructure-wise, given that he had held that previous docket when he was given that particular opportunity to serve within the African Union, so how beneficial will it be for Kenya and the continent at large?
So yeah, maybe also just to echo what Engineer said, is also to wish him well, because he's squaring it out against 300 candidates across the continent. So, so yeah, in terms of infrastructure, I think maybe completing some of the cross-border infrastructure projects that we have in the country, like LAPSET, so the Lamu corridor project, also SGR. You know, how can we champion for, because now in that seat you're looking at it continentally, not just with a Kenyan bias. we need, let's say, rail infrastructure that cuts across different countries so that there's accessibility is increased as a result of that. So how can the former Prime Minister, in his position as AU chairperson, assist with some of this infrastructure development? And also mobilization of funds, because we've seen, funds is really the challenge, isn't it, in terms of us completing some of these projects, because even if it's accessing loans, how can we get loans at an affordable rate in terms of, so what will he be doing continentally to help Africa's case in infrastructure development with a funding model that is sustainable, so that African countries can actually repay these loans without defaulting. Yeah.
And of course, we have even seen the president talking about that the current model that many countries have been using, especially when it comes to the international monetary funds, the World Bank, has been a little bit biased towards the third world countries, because it subjugates them to ensure that they pay up the loan, but at the cost of not spurring economic growth. So is this something that he needs to champion for, especially if he gets that particular seat?
Absolutely, absolutely. For a long time, Africa has been left behind by the first world and using most of the third world, Africa for the most part, to champion their own agendas. And I hope, and it's my prayer, that once he gets into, and if he gets into I pray for that he gets it, he can be able to champion that at the world stage and be able to renegotiate those loans that are crippling most of African countries, where we're talking about education, but there's much more, like Brian said, infrastructure. Africa is still very far behind in infrastructure, and therefore my prayer is that once he gets into that seat, he can be able to champion that as well, and go toe-to-toe with the first world as well.
And coming back to you, Brian, we are talking about unemployment. Given that you've seen many youths in this particular country who have been able to graduate, but they have not gotten that particular opportunities because the opportunities are fine between, especially here in our country. So what can be done? What are those missing gaps that if the government or other agencies, even in the private sector, can nip in the bud and ensure some of these youths are at least employed?
Yeah, I think, of course, like I said, we need to create the number of jobs that are available. So we need to look at creative ways of creating jobs. We have the affordable housing program, which is meant to increase, from the Kenya Kwanza manifesto, is meant to increase jobs in the housing sector, because the output, yes, is a house, but there's a lot of skilled labor that is required to build that house. I think also in terms of young people, we also, maybe I'd encourage them to also plug into a lot of these programs that are out there. There's a lot of even non-governmental organizations that run very good programs that can either give them funding or give them access to information or give them access to a community where you can share. For example, Young Scientists Kenya, Youth Alive, Youth Empowerment Program, and so on. So also looking at different avenues, instead of just saying, okay, fine, I want a job, but where can I fit in? Which society can I fit in that can allow me to network with like-minded people and give me the best chance of getting an opportunity?
And of course, if you're just joining us, we're talking about the State of the Nation and Youth Agenda. We're currently taking stock of our country's Katiba, given that Kenya is celebrating 14 years since the promulgation of the 2010 Constitution, the Constitution that is yet to be fully implemented, a document that was hailed not just here in the country, but across the world. We're looking at the achievements, especially in the development as well as in the education sector, and what can be improved. You can also join in the conversation. Talk to us on our social media platforms at KBC Channel 1 as well as at Abdiaziz Hashim 1. Of course, we'll also be keeping tabs on some of the stories or live events that are currently happening. And in conjunction to what we're discussing here will be the Katiba at 14 at the remarkable or historical house called Ufungamano House. You've seen the historical importance of that particular house. The Katiba 14 celebration is ongoing there. We do understand that the Wiper Party leader, Kalonzo Musyoka, who declared himself as the face of the opposition, will also be joining people there to be celebrating the country's Katiba at 14. Let me come back here to Daktari. We have seen, especially from the Gen Zs, how they have been well educated when it comes to the Constitution itself. As in the generation that you are you proud of these young men and women who have been able to ensure that they have been able to grasp the Constitution and what it is required in the country that is yet to be implemented?
I'm proud of the Gen Zs because they have a point, they're making a point, which cannot be ignored. But at the same time, I would also note that whatever we do, whatever the Gen Zs do, they also carry a responsibility to the country and to themselves also. So yes, they have real issues that they would like to be addressed. And we as adults need to be humble enough to listen to them. But I'm also saying that the Gen Zs and everybody else involved also need to take their responsibilities seriously, because everything that we do as adults, as young people, has consequences. And these consequences, we will see them. At the end of the day, when there's destruction, for example, we will pay for it. We'll pay for it somehow, because all the destruction has to be taken care of at the end of the day. So the responsibility part of it is important, as well as listening to what they're saying on a round table if possible.
And of course, we were talking about this earlier on, accountability and transparency, Brian. How critical is that, especially in our country at this stage?
Very, very important. You know, the other thing that we should recognize as a gain of the Constitution is the promotion of human rights and social responsibility amongst everybody, really. So everyone has a right to freedom, to education, to health care, and everything else. So accountability then comes at the forefront, because it's embedded in our Constitution and it's a right of every citizen of the Republic of Kenya. So therefore, the governance that we have, both from a national, county level, and all other spheres of government in Kenya, I beg your pardon, have to be held to the highest account possible, and which is good, which is what we've seen from the Gen Z revolution. And obviously we've seen a lot of changes now. We have a broad-based government. We're here to see how that will sort of unfold in the next months. I think the jury is still out because it's early days. But yes, we definitely need to see greater accountability from our leaders.
And accountability when it comes to that particular leadership. So how are we going to ensure, Daktari, that in the coming generations that they are taught better, so that we do not find ourselves in the same predicament that we are in currently?
I believe that we should start with the civics education at the very, very lower level in primary schools, going on to higher education. Civic education, I think, is very, very important for us to understand. The children need to understand what their responsibilities are from the very beginning. What does civics do? What does it mean to be civilized? What's civics? What's civil society? What does it even mean? Because most of what I see, in my view, is that it's easy to jump onto a bandwagon without questioning or even understanding what it is all about that we are talking. So yeah, we need to have some accountability of some kind, yes, on both sides, on either side, and probably above anything else, we need to have a dialogue so that we can be able to understand one another, not talking across one another. It is not enough to start name calling when we have a conversation. And I think we need to start there. We need to start to have conversations, civil conversations.
And Brian, do we have the goodwill, given that we have a document that is 14 years old, that is yet to be fully implemented, do we have the goodwill to implement it fully?
that is what we are hoping for. That's what we'd all like to see. So obviously we've elected our leaders, and we have elected them so that they can represent us. So we need to see at least the goodwill coming from the leaders. But at least we know now, if it doesn't work out, I think nobody is under any illusions. I think the youth are not just going to sit pretty and let the country go in a different direction. I think they'll speak up. They know that, and even if it cools down in terms of the demonstrations, Kenyans are acutely aware that every 5 years we have an election, and we can make a different decision if we have to. So we need to see, because like I said, we had this mini revolution, as I would call it, which has led to certain changes. So we need to see now really the goodwill come out from the leaders, and make sure that even representation is touched upon, especially on the marginalized group, women, persons with disability,
yes.
and the youth fall under that category, don't they?
Yes.
To see greater representation from all those parties, and also bringing them to the fore of our development.
Yes, indeed, Daktari. One of the things that have been very elusive in this particular country is the 2/3 gender rule that we are yet to attain as a country. This shortfall, how can it be addressed as an expert, as an educationist? Where is this particular leadership, especially in the country, missing the link to ensure that the 2/3 gender rule is implemented? You even remember the former Chief Justice David Maraga had even called the dissolution of Parliament for not implementing the rule.
First of all, I would start with a question. I'm not sure how many of us have read the entire document. And so we probably sometimes fight over things that we do not even understand. But I've also written a book to that effect, where
Yes.
the gender is a factor. Women have been at the forefront of doing a lot of things, including the church itself. And so the 2/3 rule, gender rule, is a good starting point. But at the same time, we also need to look at generally who qualifies for whichever position that is there with the gender rule, which is, for the most part, the Western world is also doing very well with the gender rule. And Kenya probably has got a very good example to set, where it is also in the constitution. Some countries, Western countries, don't even have that in their constitutions. So we are at the forefront if we can do it well. But we need to have a conversation around those areas.
And Brian, the same. We have yet to implement this 2/3 gender rule in our country. You have been out there. What are they doing differently as opposed to here in Kenya?
Well, I think it's more the willingness to do it. So I think, first of all, it shouldn't be like a cosmetic exercise where we are looking to implement the gender rule just for the sake of it. I think we really need to prioritize this for gender and all marginalized groups. Because also persons with disability, it's important that they have a voice, because it's not through any fault of their own that they're disabled, or at least for some of them. So we need to see a lot of these groups represented. I think that would give a voice that is, we talk about broad-based, you'd give a voice that's more holistic. Yeah. When you have different groups with different opinions and different ways of seeing life, then of course it helps with the better governance and better understanding of the nuances and intricacies of, let's say, society and humanity at large. So I think it's important we see the different groups coming in.
And going forward, Daktari, given that we're entering the final leg of the program, we're talking about the implementation of this particular constitution, a very young document that is yet to be fully implemented. What can the government do more to ensure that this constitution is upheld and even improve it down the line?
Education, education, education. I remember 2010, when the constitution was being promulgated at that time, there was not good enough education, civic education. And therefore, each one of the groups in the country were looking for a tiny, small article that benefits them or they have an interest in. And therefore, goes back to the question I asked earlier. How many Kenyans have read the entire document to understand what it entails and critique what they think needs to be tweaked? I think the jury, again, is still out there for those kind of questions because we tend to focus on small little things. For example, the presidency, prime minister, the cabinet, governors, and the other positions which are very, very important at the local level. We never talked about them at all. And one more critique from me is that we have 47 counties, 47 governors. This needs to be looked at because the wage bill is biggest at that level. In the US, counties have got chairmen, not governors. A state like Georgia has 159 counties. So would we have 159 governors? That is an element that needs to be worked through. But education, again, has to be the key. Because we can talk about all things, but the wage bill, the wage bill in Kenya probably is taking out a lot from anything else we are trying to do. I hope I'm wrong, but we'll see.
Similar, you can have comments on that as well. And as you respond, what are some of the recommendations and policies that can be made to ensure, given that you know the conversation, the country to go for a referendum so as to change some things in that particular 2010 document have been rife?
I think for me it would be distribution of resources as a key element. So, of course, in the Constitution we have 15% minimum needs to be distributed to the autonomous or semi-autonomous county governments. So if you're talking about referendum, I'd actually like to see that increased to minimum 35. Because there's no doubt if you transverse the country, you can actually visibly see a lot of the gains that have happened in the country. Yes, there has been corruption, so some will argue that there's corruption also as well, but I do agree, and that's something that if there's one thing that's going to hold us back from where we want to get to, it's going to be corruption. There's no doubt about that in my mind. But at least from a resource perspective, we should see more resources coming. And also the equalization fund that's included in the Constitution, that's actually meant to, all this is about, even this discourse we're having now, is also about uplifting people in marginalized areas, isn't it? That child in Samburu, that girl in Samburu who comes from a pastoralist community and wants to get a fair crack at life or even education. So how can we see the equalization fund being used into even better use so that a lot of the children, the marginalized groups, the women and so on, persons with disability can access it and we can see improvements in the nation.
And some of this conversation, the reason why I'm saying referendum, we have even seen policy changes that are going to be made in the coming days, where the Speaker of the National Assembly, that is Moses Masika Wetangula, as well as Chief Justice Martha Koome, were asking, why do we need to have all these bursaries? From the we have a CDF kitty that run by MPs, we have the MCAs who have a kitty in a similar nature, we also have the governors who have a similar kitty, and you'll see some of the duplication. These are some of the areas that needs to be harnessed so as to ensure that every child at least gets one of the rights that have been clearly stipulated in this particular document.
Those are the things that we all need to have a conversation around, because you cannot have decentralized bursaries and distribution of resources where one MP is doing one thing, the governor is doing another, and somebody else at the civic, at the public service is doing something else. These, in my view, should be harnessed in order that the resources can go to the right places at the right time. Instead of having one MP controlling what he or she thinks is her kitty, because it's not. These are public funds. And therefore, a conversation around this and the centralization of these resources, I think, is paramount. It needs to be done and done quickly.
And of course, going back to what you're talking about corruption, have we ensured, given that we do have independent offices such as the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, we have the Control of Budget, we have the Auditor General's Office, institutions that have been protected by the Constitution, have we done enough as a country to protect those institutions and well resource them?
So those are two questions.
Yes.
I think, yeah, in terms of seeing the institutions working, I think we've seen them in bits. I don't think we can say, if we're being honest with ourselves, that they're working maybe the way we would like them to be working. Because some of these cases, let's say, that are brought up with the ESCC and then obviously investigated by the DPP office. We need to see cases moving, and I think what Kenyans want to see at the end of the day is a determination in court. Yeah. Whether high profile or not, but we need to see something that actually gets to the end of the process for us to say, okay, fine, our institutions are working. In terms of the resource allocation, my hope is they're getting enough resources. At least you heard when the president took office, he said the office of the IG will be allocated their own budget so that the police, because resources as in the past historically, being used as an avenue to control certain institutions. When you deny them resources, then they are under your mercy. But if you can see more of that in the other institutions, then I think they'll be able to thrive, because they are Kenyans with goodwill who want to make a difference.
Okay, let's finalize on this particular program right now. Let me get your thoughts as we wind up. Let me start with you, Daktari. What are your thoughts going forward and what needs to be improved?
From where I'm sitting, I think we need to have a national conversation about what kind of nation we'd like to be. One of the things perhaps we can have a conversation around is, do we want to be a civilized nation or not? Do we want to do things well or not? One of the things I find interesting is that we do a lot of things in Kenya. Sorry to mention this, but it doesn't look like we are able to do some of these things well enough to perfection. And I think as a nation, we need to start thinking about, if it is construction, we need to have people who think, who have got critical thinking, so that you do not have haphazard buildings and electrical wires hanging loose and electrical switches behind doors. I don't think that's the standard. Water, how does water move around? How do we work on sewer systems? We still have open sewer systems in this day and age today. If you go around, you see that. How do we work through this so that we can have a better Kenya, a better environment for ourselves?
And Brian, your last remarks?
Yeah, so just to echo maybe the points and the discussion we've had, I think the Kenya Constitution has had a lot of gains for our country in all spheres. We've touched mostly on education and infrastructure and development, but also you can see even in the other softer areas, human and freedom, basic freedoms of citizenship, and also the understanding that every citizen is entitled to some of these freedoms that are embedded in our constitution. So I think what we need to see going forward now is obviously better, greater use of resources. I would just like to echo that point again. Corruption is still, in my opinion, the biggest menace that we have, and we need to curtail it so that there's enough resources that are available to do some of these programs.
Thank you so much. That is Brian Mongerai, governance expert, and Dr. Charles Nyaga, an educationist, who have been here with us since morning. We're talking about some of the hits and misses that we've been able to gain through the Constitution that we are celebrating 40 years later on. What have we been able to achieve with the Constitution that is yet to be fully implemented? That puts a cap to our first conversation. We need to take a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll be talking about culture modernity, building unity and diversity through a community all the way from Narok County. We'll be discussing with them. They're already here in the studio. Don't go too far for that particular conversation.